Margaret Thompson had endured 6 months of relentless workplace harassment at Sterling Marketing Group in downtown Chicago. At 58, this seasoned data analyst possessed a quiet dignity that her younger colleagues mistook for weakness. They saw her modest cardigans, practical shoes, and humble demeanor as signs of inferiority, never suspecting that beneath her unassuming exterior lay a secret that would soon shatter their cruel assumptions. What began as subtle mockery had escalated into public humiliation, with 32-year-old Brittany Walsh leading a vicious campaign of psychological warfare. The breaking point came on a frigid December afternoon when Brittany hurled a can of Coca-Cola at Margaret, soaking her wool cardigan while screaming "trailer trash" as her accomplices filmed the assault. But Margaret Thompson carried more than just the weight of workplace cruelty. She bore the crushing burden of her family's century-old farm facing foreclosure, a financial crisis that made every insult cut deeper. They thought she was defenseless. They thought she was alone. They had no idea that her quiet phone call would unleash a force that would burn their world to the ground. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The harassment had grown increasingly vicious as winter deepened over the Windy City. Brittany Walsh, draped in her signature Gucci accessories, had transformed Margaret's workspace into a battlefield of humiliation. Tyler Morrison, the arrogant 29-year-old sales representative with his slicked-back hair and $1,000 suits, delighted in suggesting that Margaret was begging for change outside the building whenever she arrived via public transportation. 26-year-old Sophia Chen, obsessed with her Instagram following, had made Margaret's suffering into social media content, posting cruel videos with hashtags that mocked her appearance to her 15,000 followers. The most devastating betrayal came from 45-year-old Robert Hayes, the weak-willed team leader who should have protected her, but instead enabled the abuse by dumping meaningless busywork on her desk while questioning whether she'd even attended college. The toxic atmosphere had reached a fever pitch that December day when Margaret received the devastating call from First National Bank. Foreclosure proceedings on her family's 160-acre farm in downstate Illinois would begin immediately. The same land where 4 generations of Thompsons had worked the soil, where her late mother had raised prize-winning Holstein cattle, was about to be lost forever. As Margaret sat in that sterile break room, her hands trembling while she dialed her husband's number, she had no idea that this moment of deepest despair would become the catalyst for the most dramatic reversal of fortune her tormentors could ever imagine. The harassment campaign against Margaret Thompson began with the subtle cruelty that often characterizes workplace bullying. Whispered comments, eye rolls, and the kind of social exclusion that older Americans who lived through decades of office politics would recognize all too well. What started as occasional snide remarks about her practical wardrobe gradually transformed into a systematic assault on her dignity that would have tested the resolve of even the strongest individual. Brittany Walsh, with her perfectly manicured nails and designer handbags that cost more than many families spent on groceries in a month, had identified Margaret as an easy target from the moment she walked through Sterling Marketing's glass doors 6 months earlier. The 20-something account manager possessed that particular brand of entitled cruelty that comes from never having faced real hardship, never having worked a factory job to put herself through college, never having watched a parent struggle to keep food on the table during the lean years. The psychological warfare escalated with military precision as Chicago's brutal winter deepened. Brittany had recruited her allies with the calculated efficiency of a general assembling troops for battle. Tyler Morrison, the sales representative whose slicked-back hair and $1,000 suits screamed new money, delighted in making Margaret the butt of his jokes during morning meetings. His favorite target was her daily commute via the Chicago Transit Authority, a choice that spoke to her practical nature and environmental consciousness, values that older generations understood came from growing up during times when waste was considered sinful. "Hey, Margaret," he would call out across the open office space, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured concern that made everyone within earshot cringe. "I saw someone who looked just like you, asking for spare change outside Union Station this morning. You sure you're not moonlighting?" The laughter that followed was the kind that made decent people look away in shame. But Tyler basked in it like a lizard soaking up desert sun. Sophia Chen, barely 26 and obsessed with her Instagram following of 15,000 strangers, had turned Margaret's suffering into content for her social media empire. The young designer would surreptitiously film Margaret's reactions to the daily humiliations, posting clips with hashtags like #OfficeLife and #ThriftStoreChic that her followers devoured with the hungry enthusiasm of spectators at a Roman Colosseum. What made Sophia's cruelty particularly insidious was its modern twist. She was weaponizing technology to amplify Margaret's humiliation beyond the confines of the office, broadcasting her pain to thousands of strangers who would never know the full story. For someone of Margaret's generation, who remembered when workplace conflicts stayed within office walls, this digital dimension of harassment felt like a violation of fundamental human decency. Robert Hayes, the 45-year-old team leader who should have been the voice of reason and protection, instead became the most disappointing betrayer of all. His weakness reminded Margaret of the middle managers she'd encountered throughout her career, men who had climbed just high enough to taste power, but lacked the backbone to use it responsibly. Robert's contribution to the harassment campaign came in the form of administrative torture, meaningless assignments that served no purpose except to waste Margaret's time and demonstrate his authority. He would dump stacks of outdated reports on her desk with theatrical flourishes, announcing to anyone within earshot that he was keeping Margaret busy since she doesn't seem to have enough real work to do. His favorite humiliation was questioning her educational background during team meetings, asking with mock concern whether she had actually attended college or just picked up her skills somewhere along the way. The cruelty reached new heights as Margaret's personal financial crisis deepened. Unknown to her tormentors, she was fighting a desperate battle to save her family's 160-acre farm in downstate Illinois, the same land where 4 generations of Thompsons had worked the rich black soil, where her grandmother had raised prize-winning Holstein cattle during the Great Depression, where her late mother had taught her that dignity came from honest work rather than fancy clothes. The farm that had survived the Dust Bowl, World War II rationing, and countless economic downturns was now facing foreclosure because of medical bills from her mother's final illness. Margaret had been quietly draining her savings to keep up with the mortgage payments, taking on extra freelance work in the evenings, and cutting every possible expense, which explained her modest wardrobe and brown bag lunches that her colleagues mocked so mercilessly. The psychological pressure created a perfect storm of stress that would have broken many people half Margaret's age. Each morning, she would steel herself for another day of verbal assault while simultaneously fielding calls from First National Bank about overdue payments. The irony was crushing. Here, she sat in an office worth millions, surrounded by people who spent more on lunch than she had budgeted for groceries, while her family's century-old legacy hung by a thread. The weight of that secret burden made every insult cut deeper, every cruel joke feel like salt in an open wound. When Brittany would make snide comments about Margaret's thrift store wardrobe, she had no idea that every dollar saved on clothing was another day the farm might survive. The harassment campaign's psychological sophistication would have impressed military interrogators. The 4 bullies had unconsciously developed a rotation system that ensured Margaret never had a moment's peace. If Brittany wasn't making cutting remarks about her appearance, Tyler was questioning her competence. If Tyler was momentarily occupied with actual work, Sophia was filming her for social media mockery. If Sophia was distracted by her phone, Robert was dumping busy work on her desk. The constant nature of the assault meant that Margaret could never fully relax, never let her guard down, never simply focus on the data analysis work that she genuinely loved and excelled at. The breaking point approached with the inexorable force of a freight train, as December's bitter winds howled through Chicago's concrete canyons. Margaret's colleagues had no idea that their victim possessed reserves of strength forged by decades of real hardship, the kind that comes from growing up on a farm where failure meant genuine hunger, where winter storms could kill livestock and destroy livelihoods, where survival depended on community cooperation rather than individual cruelty. They mistook her quiet dignity for weakness, her refusal to engage in their petty games for submission, her modest appearance for poverty rather than choice. The final escalation came on a Friday afternoon when the office buzzed with pre-weekend energy, and the bullies felt emboldened by their months of unchallenged success. Margaret had just received the devastating call from First National Bank. Foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately, unless she could produce $37,000 within 10 business days. As she sat at her desk, trying to process the magnitude of her loss while maintaining her professional composure, Brittany Walsh approached with the predatory smile of someone who sensed weakness and intended to exploit it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the careful balance Margaret had maintained for 6 months, forcing her to make a choice between her principles and her survival that would change everything forever. The confrontation that would forever change the landscape of Sterling Marketing Group began on a bitter December afternoon, when Chicago's wind howled through the downtown canyons with the fury of a Midwestern blizzard. Margaret Thompson sat at her modest desk, her hands trembling, not from the cold seeping through the office windows, but from the devastating phone call she had just received from First National Bank. The foreclosure notice was final. $37,000 within 10 business days, or her family's 160-acre farm would be lost forever. The same land where her great-grandfather had broken prairie sod with a team of Belgian draft horses in 1892, where her grandmother had milked Holstein cows through the Great Depression, where her mother had taught her that dignity came from honest work rather than fancy clothes. All of it would be gone unless she could produce a sum that might as well have been $37 million. As Margaret sat there processing the magnitude of her loss, trying to maintain her professional composure, while her world crumbled around her, Brittany Walsh approached with the predatory smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. The 20-something account manager had been watching Margaret's distress from across the office, and something about the older woman's vulnerability seemed to trigger her cruelest instincts. Brittany's designer heels clicked against the polished concrete floor with the rhythm of a countdown timer, each step bringing her closer to a moment that would define both their futures in ways neither could imagine. "Well, well, well," Brittany announced loudly enough for half the office to hear, her voice dripping with manufactured concern that fooled no one. "Looks like someone's having a rough day. Let me guess. Did the bank call about your trailer payment?" The words hung in the air like poison gas, designed to humiliate and wound. Tyler Morrison looked up from his computer screen, his slicked-back hair catching the fluorescent lights as he grinned with anticipation. Sophia Chen immediately reached for her phone, sensing that something worth filming was about to unfold. Even Robert Hayes emerged from his glass-walled office, adjusting his tie with the nervous energy of someone who knew he should intervene, but lacked the courage to do so. Margaret's response was measured, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her heart. "I'm fine, Brittany, just focusing on my work." But her tormentor wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The months of unchallenged harassment had emboldened Brittany to new heights of cruelty, and she sensed that this moment represented her ultimate opportunity to break the woman she had targeted for so long. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present. A moment of violence that crossed every line of human decency and professional conduct. "Oh, you're fine?" Brittany's voice rose to a shriek that could be heard throughout the entire floor. "You're fine sitting there in your Goodwill cardigan, pretending to be something you're not? We all know what you really are." Without warning, she grabbed the can of Coca-Cola from her desk, a 12-ounce can that had been sitting there since lunch, and hurled it with the force of someone throwing a fastball. The aluminum projectile struck Margaret squarely in the chest, exploding on impact and drenching her wool cardigan in sticky brown liquid that immediately began to stain the fabric beyond repair. The assault didn't end there. As Margaret sat stunned by the physical attack, Tyler Morrison leaped from his chair with the enthusiasm of someone joining a mob. His $1,000 Italian leather shoes connected with Margaret's desk chair, sending it spinning and nearly toppling her to the floor. "Yeah, trailer trash," he shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "Maybe, now, you'll finally get the message that you don't belong here." Sophia Chen had her phone out instantly, filming the entire assault while laughing with the kind of hysterical glee that comes from watching someone else's suffering. "This is gold," she screamed, her voice barely audible over her own cackling. "Say goodbye to your dignity, loser." The office had become a coliseum, with Margaret as the victim and her 3 tormentors as the gladiators. Other employees watched in horrified silence, some looking away in shame, others frozen by the sudden explosion of violence that had shattered the veneer of professional civility. Robert Hayes stood in his office doorway, his face pale with the realization that the situation had spiraled completely beyond his control, but still lacking the backbone to intervene and stop the assault. Margaret sat there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, cola dripping from her hair and soaking through her cardigan to the simple white blouse beneath. Her hazel eyes, usually so gentle and kind, reflected a depth of pain that went far beyond the physical assault. This wasn't just about workplace bullying anymore. This was about the systematic destruction of a human being's dignity, witnessed by dozens of colleagues who had chosen silence over solidarity. The woman who had endured months of psychological torture, while fighting to save her family's legacy, had finally reached the breaking point that every victim of sustained harassment eventually faces. But Margaret Thompson was not just any victim. As she reached for her phone with hands that no longer trembled, there was something in her movement that suggested hidden reserves of strength. The quiet dignity that her tormentors had mistaken for weakness was about to reveal itself as something far more powerful. Her fingers moved across the screen with deliberate precision, dialing a number she knew by heart, a number that would summon forces beyond her colleague's wildest imagination. "Nathan," she said quietly into the phone, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent office with the clarity of a church bell. "I need you to come to the office. Now." The simplicity of those words belied their explosive potential. She didn't need to explain what had happened. The tone of her voice, the background noise of her tormentors still celebrating their victory, the sound of liquid dripping onto the floor, all of it painted a picture that would ignite a fury in Nathan Pierce that few people had ever witnessed. As Margaret ended the call and set her phone down with the same deliberate care she brought to everything in her life, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. Brittany, Tyler, and Sophia were still basking in their moment of triumph, completely unaware that they had just crossed a line that would destroy their careers and redefine their understanding of power. The other employees sensed something momentous approaching, though they couldn't yet comprehend the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Margaret stood slowly, cola still dripping from her cardigan, and walked to the break room with the measured steps of someone who had made a decision that would change everything. Behind her, she left a trail of sticky footprints and the lingering echo of a phone call that would soon bring the full weight of Chicago's business elite crashing down on the heads of three people who had mistaken cruelty for strength, harassment for humor, and silence for weakness. The quiet woman they had tormented for months was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most devastating storms come from the calmest skies. The elevator doors opened with the soft chime that had become as familiar as breathing to the employees of Sterling Marketing Group. But what emerged from that polished steel chamber would forever alter the trajectory of every person on the 32nd floor. Nathan Pierce stepped into the office with the commanding presence of a man who had built an empire from nothing. His 6'2" frame filling the doorway like a force of nature contained in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that whispered money without shouting it. His dark hair, touched with distinguished silver at the temples, was swept back with the kind of precision that spoke to decades of boardroom battles, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold fire of someone who had just witnessed an unforgivable transgression against the person he loved most in the world. The office fell silent with the sudden completeness of a theater when the curtain rises. Conversations died mid-sentence, keyboards stopped clicking, and even the perpetual hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in anticipation. Heads turned with the synchronized precision of a military drill, and in that moment of crystalline clarity, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about in Chicago business circles for decades to come. Brittany Walsh, still basking in the afterglow of her vicious assault on Margaret, felt her designer's smile freeze on her face as recognition dawned with the slow horror of watching a freight train approach. Tyler Morrison, his $1,000 Italian leather shoes still sticky with spilled cola, choked on his own saliva as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. Sophia Chen's phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering to the polished concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Nathan's gaze swept the room with the methodical precision of a general surveying a battlefield, taking in every detail: the overturned chair, the puddle of cola still spreading across the floor, the scattered papers, and most importantly, his wife, standing there with quiet dignity despite the brown stains on her wool cardigan and the dampness in her silver-streaked hair. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the volcanic fury building beneath his composed exterior. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, each word delivered with the precision of a master craftsman wielding his finest tools. "Margaret," he said, his tone gentle despite the steel beneath it, "you ready to go home?" The simple question hung in the air like a benediction, offering sanctuary to the woman who had endured months of systematic cruelty while fighting to save her family's legacy. Margaret looked up at her husband with eyes that reflected both relief and love, the kind of deep, abiding affection that comes from 30 years of marriage and shared struggles that had only strengthened their bond. "Just need to gather my things, Nathan," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake that had just shaken her world. As she began collecting her belongings with the same methodical care she brought to everything in her life, the office atmosphere grew thick with the kind of tension that precedes natural disasters. Brittany Walsh, her survival instincts finally overriding her shock, attempted to salvage the situation with the desperate charm of someone trying to talk her way out of a sinking ship. "Mr. Pierce," she exclaimed, her voice pitched with artificial sweetness that fooled absolutely no one. "What a wonderful surprise. I'm Brittany Walsh, Senior Account Manager. We weren't expecting you today, but I'd be delighted to show you around our department. Perhaps we could discuss some exciting new initiatives over coffee." She fluttered her eyelashes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had always relied on her looks to navigate difficult situations, completely oblivious to the fact that she was attempting to charm a man whose wife she had just physically assaulted. Nathan's response was delivered with the kind of Arctic coldness that made Chicago's winter winds seem tropical by comparison. He didn't even glance in Brittany's direction, his attention focused entirely on Margaret as she carefully placed her few personal items into her worn leather tote bag. The silence stretched like a rubber band approaching its breaking point, and when Nathan finally turned to address the room, his words carried the weight of divine judgment. "I'd like to know," he said, his voice carrying easily across the open office space, "who's been making my wife's life a living hell for the past 6 months. The word wife detonated like a nuclear bomb in the center of the room, sending shockwaves through every person present. Brittany's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden pallor that drained the color from her face. Tyler Morrison's cocky swagger evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a trembling man who suddenly understood that his world was about to collapse. Sophia Chen stared at Margaret with the wide-eyed horror of someone who had just realized she'd been filming the wife of one of Chicago's most powerful men. Robert Hayes emerged from his glass-walled office like a condemned man walking to the gallows, his tie askew and sweat beading on his forehead despite the office's perfectly controlled climate. "Mr. Pierce, sir," he stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Margaret is a valued member of our team, and we've always treated her with the utmost respect and professionalism." The lie hung in the air like a bad smell, contradicted by the physical evidence of the assault that still dripped from Margaret's clothing and pooled on the floor. Nathan's laugh was devoid of any warmth, a sound that spoke of boardroom battles and corporate warfare fought with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had never lost a significant conflict. "Valued?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You call hurling beverages at someone valued treatment? You call systematic harassment and humiliation respect? You call creating a hostile work environment professionalism?" Each question landed like a physical blow, and Robert Hayes visibly flinched with every word. The revelation that followed would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in Chicago business history. Nathan Pierce, chairman of Pierce Enterprises and one of the Midwest's most influential businessmen, stood before a room full of people who had spent months tormenting his wife, completely unaware that they were attacking someone under the protection of one of the city's most powerful figures. The irony was so complete, so perfectly devastating, that it seemed almost orchestrated by the gods of poetic justice. "Let me make something crystal clear," Nathan continued, his voice gaining strength like a gathering storm. "Margaret Pierce, yes, Pierce, as in Pierce Enterprises, as in the company that owns the holding company that owns this pathetic excuse for a marketing firm, has been subjected to months of systematic abuse by people who assumed she was powerless because she chose to dress modestly and work quietly. You judged her by her cardigan instead of her character, by her humility instead of her heart, by her silence instead of her strength." The dramatic revelation reached its crescendo when Nathan announced his immediate response to the situation. But first came an even more stunning disclosure that would cement this moment in the annals of corporate legend. "Robert," Nathan said, turning his attention to the cowering team leader, "I've just received some interesting information from my legal team. It seems that First National Bank was about to foreclose on a certain 160-acre farm in downstate Illinois, a farm that's been in the Thompson family for 4 generations. Well, I've just purchased that mortgage and transferred it to a family trust, ensuring that Margaret's heritage will be protected for generations to come." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and relief, the weight of months of financial stress lifting from her shoulders like a physical burden being removed. The farm where her great-grandfather had broken prairie sod, where her grandmother had raised prize-winning cattle, where her mother had taught her the values of hard work and dignity, all of it was safe, protected by the man who loved her enough to move mountains when she needed him most. The final act of justice came with the swift efficiency of a master executioner. Brittany Walsh, Tyler Morrison, Sophia Chen, Robert Hayes, Nathan announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You are terminated immediately. Security is already on their way up to escort you from the building, and I want to be very clear about something. My influence extends far beyond this office, far beyond this building, far beyond this city. Every major corporation in the Midwest will know exactly why you were fired, and I will personally ensure that your professional reputations are as thoroughly destroyed as you attempted to destroy my wife's dignity. The security guards who arrived moments later moved with the professional efficiency of men who had handled similar situations before. But even they seemed awed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. As the 4 former employees were escorted from the building, their careers in ruins and their futures uncertain, the remaining staff watched in stunned silence, finally understanding that actions have consequences, that cruelty carries a price, and that sometimes justice arrives with the devastating completeness of a natural disaster. Nathan took Margaret's hand with infinite gentleness, his touch a stark contrast to the corporate warfare he had just unleashed. "Let's go home, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft with the kind of love that had sustained them through 3 decades of marriage. As they walked toward the elevator, Margaret glanced back once, not at her former tormentors, but at the colleagues who had remained silent during her months of suffering, her eyes holding no anger, only the quiet strength of someone who had emerged victorious, not through revenge, but through the simple act of being loved and protected by someone who understood her true worth. The aftermath of that December confrontation rippled through Chicago's business community like stones cast into still water, creating waves that would be felt for years to come. Margaret Thompson chose not to return to Sterling Marketing Group, instead launching a consulting practice that helped family-owned businesses navigate the complexities of modern commerce while preserving their traditional values. Work that resonated deeply with her own understanding of dignity earned through honest labor. Her former tormentors faced consequences that extended far beyond their immediate termination. Brittany Walsh's desperate attempts to rehabilitate her reputation through tearful LinkedIn posts and networking events fell on deaf ears, as Nathan Pierce's influence had quietly but effectively closed doors throughout the Midwest's corporate landscape. Tyler Morrison found himself bouncing between increasingly menial sales positions, his swagger replaced by the hollow desperation of someone who had gambled everything on cruelty and lost. Sophia Chen abandoned social media entirely, her 15,000 followers drifting away like autumn leaves as she retreated from the digital world that had once validated her existence. Robert Hayes simply vanished from the industry, becoming a cautionary tale whispered in management training seminars about the cost of weak leadership. Margaret's story became legend among Chicago's business elite, not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that character matters more than appearance, that quiet strength often trumps loud arrogance, and that the most powerful force in any workplace is simple human decency, backed by unwavering love and protection. Have you ever witnessed workplace bullying or found yourself judging someone based on their appearance rather than their character? Margaret's story reminds us that every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of how they dress or where they come from. If this tale of quiet strength triumphing over cruelty resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share your own experiences in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the power of human resilience and the importance of treating everyone with kindness.